because consciousness is a tool of the genes, it is scaled to think at the level that would have been useful to the ancestors in which consciousness emerged. In other words, it makes sense to think a couple generations down the line, but it doesn't make sense to think 100 generations down the line, not because that isn't important, but because you have no ability to impact it. Right? A hunter-gatherer who tried to think about how they could alter their behavior to benefit their descendants 100 generations later would have had no ability to make any useful change. So it makes sense to be focused on things that are local to you in space and time until you reach modernity. You and I are in a very different situation, right? Our insane battling over modern stuff actually has strong implications for whether or not there are human beings here 10,000 years from now, right? In fact, it's more likely than not that there won't be. In order for there to be human beings here 10,000 years from now, we are going to have to behave very carefully, and we're going to have to figure out how to preserve the precious opportunity that we have, wherever it came from. So my point is that consciousness of mine is artificially stuck artificially locally, right? If selection had been built in creatures that had impacts 10,000 years in the future, our consciousness would be scaled to be able to see 10,000 years in the future and care about it. But we're not good at it because our ancestors were limited. The power of their tools was small.
Yeah,
and so
I think that there are some consciousnesses, human consciousness, that are able to see not 10,000 years in the future in the granular sense, but 10,000 years in the future in the pattern sense. They're able to perceive higher patterns.
Great.
And are able to talk about cycles, great cycles of being and great cycles of civilization. Like I don't think that this is something which has not been available to people. And the same thing with consciousness. I think that all religious practices believe that consciousness can increase, and that you can increase, the capacity of consciousness to perceive patterns and to engage in patterns and to transform patterns, right? Which is why we name things after people, right? Which is why we have patrons of things. Like the consciousness can become, let's say, the guarantors of aspects of reality, you could say. So I think that the way that religion talks about consciousness seems to understand that consciousness is the point of where all of this comes together, and that it's working on consciousness, which is more important than the technical stuff. Like a good example is something, there's a saying which is in Judaism and it's in Christianity too, right? The just holds the world together. The just is the foundation of the world, and that the idea that becoming a better person is the best thing you can do for that to happen. Like one of the reasons why we're in the mess we're in is because we started to perceive the world only materially, and that the idea of gaining material power and gaining power on the world was the highest purpose that we could imagine. So we created these massive technological systems which are driving us into madness, which are making us crazy. We've actually moved away from the ideals which held religion together. Even if religions did bring about wars, brought about some horrible stuff, religious thinking has never brought humanity to the precipice of destruction, like the very existence of the world being held in the balance. Whereas as we move away from that and we started to think technically, scientifically only, then we come to this point where we unleash these golems on the world that we don't even understand we can't see the scope of what they're doing. We don't see, I'm even willing to give Twitter, for example, the benefit of the doubt that they didn't understand the monster they were unleashing on the world when they did. And now we see the golem turning against its master, like in all the ancient traditions of mechanical beings that don't follow the will of their master, let's say. Anyways, so I'm not sure, maybe continue on with what you think the solution is, but I don't know.
First, let me say, I don't disagree with what you said.
Yeah.
I'm sure religions have sometimes brought their own lineage to an end. Bad decision-making will have been the case, but they will not have brought humanity there. You're right. And the abandonment of religion and the embrace of full materialism, I agree, has clearly brought us there. I will also say we are stuck in space and time. Our consciousness is, which doesn't, you and I are having a conversation about what will be 10,000 years from now, right? That is us trying to bring 10,000 years from now into our consciousness. But we are in some sense like, we are using a tool that is not appropriately scaled, right? So if you think about how Mount Rushmore was carved, right? Mount Rushmore is a sculpture, right? A sculptor uses chisels. And I'm sure there were chisels used in the making of Mount Rushmore, but there was also like dynamite, right? And my point is that a chisel isn't sufficient to make Mount Rushmore. And our consciousness is going to need some upgrading if we're going to pull off the trick of figuring out where our interests actually are with respect to the future 10,000 years from now, right? And so we're basically stuck with chisels and we need to upgrade to dynamite in order to get there. But the long and short of it is we do not think in terms of providing a world to our descendants 10,000 years from now because our ancestors didn't have an opportunity at that scale, whereas we clearly do. Or more likely, we have the opportunity to rob our descendants of that future if we are not careful. And so what I'm really arguing is if it is our obligation to provide the opportunity for consciousness and love to as many descendants as we can, that means an indefinite future for humanity. That means we have to put aside the lineage against lineage battling that has shaped humanity. It has brought us this far, but we have to get past it. And so I don't want to see a synonymizing of the people of the world. I don't want to see us all be the same, but we do have to reach an agreement in which the things that cause us to jeopardize the future are shelved permanently in favor of a world that does foster consciousness, love, insight, beauty, all of the things that we would agree are inherently or close to inherently good, right? And that we're not going to get there by accident, and we're not going to get there. This is the place where you and I may differ. We are not going to get there by embracing the traditions that have arrived in the present but are not built for it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's where there I disagree because I don't see what I see in the, like, for example, I see wokeism as a desire to create these types of, a desire to create a kind of structure which will supposedly bind us together, right? I see a lot of the COVID measures as a desire to do that as well. I see things of people trying to do that, but because they are not grounded in the ancient stories, they don't understand, they don't have a kind of mythical underpinning that has been developed for millennia and millennia, then they're creating monsters. They're Frankenstein creations.
We are in total agreement about that, by the way.
Yeah. But so what I believe is that I believe that, let's say being the best Christian I can be and living with my family and my neighbors and the people around me in the best way, that's the first best thing I can do, right? That's really the first best thing I can do. And then obviously taking seriously the teachings of Christ, which is, to love your neighbor, to love your enemy, to do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. That's also important. But the way it happens is fractally. It's not, I don't think it's in creating a kind of Tower of Babel. I think it happens, but let's say in a certain manner, it happens kind of bottom up, where as these communities come together and in truth and in love and in beauty, then that creates new patterns that other people can replicate. And then those patterns get replicated. it seems that that's how it happened in the first place. Let's say if you think of even the way that Christianity spread, that's how it happened. You had people who exemplified patterned living, and that at first people hated them for it, were angry with them, but then that ended up acting like seeds, which replicated itself in other communities because they could see the good that it was bringing. But it happened that way rather than like saying we're all going to get together and we're going to agree, right? We're going to consciously agree on a way forward towards the future. That to me sounds like what people are trying to do now. And what I see coming from it, like the Great Reset and all that kind of stuff, is frightening as hell.
Oh, it's a disaster. It's a terrible disaster. And you're not wrong about it. And you're not wrong that what I'm arguing loosely fits in that same category.
Yeah.
Right. But here's the problem. I now think I can see, I don't know if I can convey it, but I think I can see what the important thing we have to get to is. And it's going to come in two forms. The first thing I have to say is we are absolutely damned if we do and damned if we don't. Okay. That is the fundamental nature of the predicament that I'm trying to describe. And I don't like it, but that's where we are as far as I can tell. And the other thing is the mechanism you just described for how we got here cannot be the mechanism that we use to get out of here. As much as that may sound like a paradox, it got us this far. If we continue to use it, it'll be our undoing. So I take the mechanism that got us here as the evolution of these religious traditions. And my point is the evolution of those religious traditions will cross through extinction. That mechanism, if we continue to allow it to drive, will drive us extinct. The alternative is terrible, which is what you're saying, right? I don't disagree with you about this, but I think we have to confront it. And the point is, religions, every adaptation, right? Forget whether it's religion or an eye or a wing or a leaf. Every adaptation is useful relative to the environment in which it evolved, right? A fish may be beautifully evolved to swim on a reef. It is terribly evolved in the bottom of the boat, right? In the bottom of the boat, it's a catastrophe of inappropriate tools, right? So my point would be the religions that brought us here are adaptive, or they were adaptive in the world in which they came about. Our world is now changing so rapidly and is composed of so many things that those religions did not foresee in any specific sense that we are.
I think they did, though. Well, I really do think they did. I really do think they did foresee what's going on.
Well, they foresee certain things. And, you point out, like, Twitter is the golem that we unleash on the world, and they didn't know what they were doing. And I agree at that level. Yes, they foresaw something, but they didn't foresee the splitting of the atom. They didn't foresee the evolution of algorithms, right? Not specifically enough to be instructive. And so here's the problem. We are stuck with an infinite regress of Chesterton's fence, right? We know, if I'm right about what religions are, that they are adaptive compendiums of wisdom, we are stuck with the fact that there is no, when you program a computer, you put comments next to the lines. You say, this function is supposed to accomplish this thing. That's why I put it here, right? Here are the arguments you submit to this function. You say that in English so that somebody else can come into your program and say, that's the job this is doing. Religion doesn't come with that, right? You get the program in the Bibles, but you don't get the explanation of how, I think I can explain why a belief in heaven is adaptive, but it's not explained anywhere.
There's an entire tradition of theology and church fathers that do exactly that.
Well, they may be trying to reverse engineer it. And there was certainly a tradition that attempted to reconcile, modern scientific thought with religious thought. I take no position on that. But my point is, if we are handed ancient compendiums of wisdom in a modern world in which some of the things in those compendiums are as relevant as ever, Some of the things in those compendiums are now irrelevant, and some of the things in those compendiums are the opposite of useful, right? They have gone from useful to dangerous because of the change in the world we live in. Then we could try to figure out which pieces are in what category, which is liable to be an error-prone exercise, dangerous in its own right and very slow. We could try to substitute something new, which will not have the benefit of having passed the test of time, and therefore we will end up with the problems of wokeism or, a COVID health policy, right? We will make error after error. And so my point is, neither of those is a survivable program. So we have to do some third thing, right? Where a friend of mine coined the term that what we have is we have to provide something that fits a religion-shaped whole, that there is a hole in our being that needs something of this form, that the ancient religions put us in danger because they're not up to speed on modern problems, and novel religions are effectively cults until they pass the test of time, and we don't have the luxury of exposing them to the test of time. So it's that third thing that we need to find.
Yeah, I mean, I guess our disagreement is very fundamental. Like, I think it's fundamental because I really do believe that religion has described exactly what we're going through, not in terms of the gritty detail, but in terms of pattern. That is, this is what we're talking about from the outset. We're talking about patterns. So there are patterns in cells, there are patterns in DNA, there are patterns in human behavior, and there are great patterns. There are large patterns of waxing and wanings of civilizations, waxing and wanings of different identities. And when we look at both, let's say, the stories in scripture, the prophetic text, we see that they're describing these patterns. And if we have the wisdom to see them as patterns, then we don't have to think even about the splitting of the atom. Because let's say a description of the pattern of excessive technical growth and excessive technical understanding, the danger of secret understanding and how that unleashes destruction on the world, is something which has been described in many, many religious texts. So
then you're telling me that the wisdom that we already have points in a Luddite direction.
No, not necessarily, because the ultimate vision of the end of all things is, like I said, the heavenly Jerusalem, which is a perfect joining of technical reality and the garden, you could say. But it's all about hierarchy. It's all about having it in the right order. One of the issues we have is the issue of materialism being in the wrong order. That is, what we see material gain and technical gain as being the God itself. That is, we run after it with abandon. We don't have a sense in which we have to judge on the value and the ultimate danger of these scientific discoveries. We just run amok. And then all of a sudden we realize the chaos which it's bringing. But that is because of a problem of hierarchy. Because we're not turned towards infinite love as the source of all things. And we don't see that the tools we set out in the world have to be bound by that attention. They have to be bound by that first direction. And so that's something which is described everywhere. Like it's described in
it's not operationalizable. Okay. So let's take the obvious example from the recent past. Okay. Gain of function research on viruses. This is a clear danger, which you, I think, will correctly describe as presaged by religious admonitions about technology. Okay.
Well, not just technology, but also, let's say, mixture of identity. You see that in the Old Testament laws, and you see it in descriptions of the developing of chimera that happened, before the flood, let's say, that kind of description.
Okay.
That kind of story.
There's a warning, if you know how to read it, in more than one religious text about something like gain of function research. Maybe that thing being encoded in our cultural identity is the reason that in 2015, the U.S. Congress sought to ban gain-of-function research. And then Anthony Fauci and Peter Daszak figured out a way around this in which they offshored the work to Wuhan.
Yeah.
Wuhan. Somehow, even if the right idea made it to the right place to make the law to forbid the behavior, we still ended up...
It happened anyways.
Yeah, it happened anyways. So my point is, it's one thing when that happens with, first century technologies. It's another thing when it happens with, 21st century technologies. And it's the 21st century technologies that are giving me the sense of urgency that we have.